The cursed treasure of Oak Island. The cold, salty air of Oak Island whipped across my face as I stood on the rocky shore, staring out at the churning waters of the North Atlantic. This was no ordinary expedition, and deep down, I knew it. There was something about Oak Island, a feeling that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, that made this place unlike any other. The legends, the whispered tales of untold riches, and the ominous curse that had claimed the lives of so many treasure hunters before me. It all felt too real, too close. We were a small crew, each of us driven by the promise of fortune buried deep within the island's soil. But as we delved deeper into the excavation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, observed by unseen eyes that lurked in the shadows of the trees. Day after day we dug, peeling back layers of earth and history. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, as if the island itself were trying to warn us of something lurking beneath. My dreams became plagued with visions of death and decay, of skeletal hands reaching up from the dirt to drag me down into the depths of the earth. I dismissed them as stress, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Then came the day we found it. It was buried in a chamber, deeper than any of us had anticipated. The stone chest was ancient, its surface etched with symbols none of us could decipher. A foul stench permeated the air as we pried it open, revealing a relic, a grotesque idol, twisted and dark, its eyes seeming to follow us as we moved. The moment it was unearthed, the air around us grew thick, suffocating, and a sense of dread washed over the group. One of our crew members, a seasoned treasure hunter with nerves of steel, was the first to touch it. He grasped the relic with trembling hands, his face contorting into a look of sheer terror. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking, as if he had seen something unimaginable. He screamed, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the island, before collapsing to the ground, lifeless. We stood there, frozen, as the realization dawned on us. The curse was real. The relic, this twisted ancient thing, had claimed its first victim. And as the shadows lengthened around us, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The crew was divided. Some wanted to leave the island, to bury the relic and forget we had ever found it. Others, driven by greed and ambition, argued that we had come too far to turn back now. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the island into an eerie twilight, the decision was made for us. One by one, the members of our crew began to vanish. The first disappearance was subtle. A missing tool, a gap in our numbers that we didn't notice until it was too late. Then more followed, their screams echoing in the distance as they were dragged into the darkness. Panic set in as we realized that whatever curse we had unleashed wasn't confined to the relic. It was in the very air we breathed, in the ground we walked upon. It was hunting us. As night fell, we gathered in the small cabin we had set up as our base, the walls creaking under the weight of an unseen presence. The air inside was stifling, the smell of decay and death overwhelming. We were trapped, cornered by the very thing we had sought. And as we huddled together, terrified and unsure, the cabin's lights flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. And then, the door creaked open slowly, agonizingly, revealing a figure shrouded in darkness. The air grew colder and I felt a hand, a cold skeletal hand on my shoulder. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Nothing except the overwhelming sense that we were not alone. And that whatever had claimed this island, whatever curse we had awakened, was far from done with us. I barely slept that night. The howling wind outside the cabin seemed to carry whispers, faint voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. Each time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Just the dark corners of the room, shadows dancing with the flickering candlelight. By dawn, 2 more of our crew were missing. We found their belongings scattered outside the cabin, their footprints leading into the dense woods. But there was no sign of them. No bodies, no blood. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The remaining crew was on edge, and the tension was palpable. Our leader, a grizzled veteran of countless expeditions, tried to maintain order, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The island had taken on a life of its own, and we were merely pawns in a game we didn't understand. "Something's out there," one of the men whispered, his voice trembling. "Something that doesn't want us here." We decided to regroup, to go back to the chamber where we had unearthed the relic. Maybe there was something we missed, some clue that could help us break the curse. But as we descended into the dark, musty tunnels, the air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over us. The chamber was just as we had left it, silent, eerie, and foreboding. The relic sat in the center, still and unmoving, but there was something different about it now. The twisted idol seemed alive. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green light that pulsated like a heartbeat. And as we stood there staring at it, I could have sworn I heard it breathing. One of the crew, a young man with a nervous disposition, moved closer to the relic, as if drawn to it. "We should destroy it," he muttered, his voice shaky. "We should have destroyed it the moment we found it." Before anyone could stop him, he swung his pickaxe at the idol. The moment the metal struck the stone, the chamber shook violently, as if the island itself were roaring in anger. The ground beneath us cracked, and a deafening scream echoed through the tunnels, an inhuman wail that pierced our ears and rattled our bones. And then the blood came. It seeped from the cracks in the floor, thick and dark, pooling around our feet. The smell was unbearable, a rancid stench that made us gag. Panic set in as we tried to retreat, but the chamber was collapsing around us, the walls closing in. We barely made it out alive, scrambling up the tunnel as the earth caved in behind us. The young man who had struck the idol wasn't so lucky. As the rest of us reached the surface, we turned to see him standing at the entrance to the chamber, his eyes wide with terror, as something pulled him back into the darkness. His screams echoed in my mind long after they had faded, a haunting reminder of the fate that awaited us all. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. Fear and paranoia had taken hold, and it was clear that we were no longer in control. The island, whatever malevolent force it harbored, was calling the shots now, and it wanted us gone. But greed is a powerful thing. Despite everything we had seen, despite the deaths and disappearances, there were those among us who still believed in the treasure, who were convinced that we were close to finding it. They argued that the curse was just superstition, that it could be broken if we persisted. That night, we split into two groups, those who wanted to continue the search, and those who wanted to leave the island. I was torn, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. But as I watched the others prepare to venture back into the depths of Oak Island, I knew that leaving was the only sane choice. And then, the lights went out. Total darkness enveloped the cabin, and in that instant a chorus of voices erupted around us. Screams, moans, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. We fumbled for our flashlights, panic taking hold, but when the lights flickered back on, what I saw made my blood run cold. The relic was in the cabin. It sat in the center of the room, its eyes glowing with that sickly green light, and the air was thick with the stench of death. The walls seemed to close in, the temperature plummeting, and that same skeletal hand I had felt the night before brushed against my arm, sending a jolt of terror through my body. One by one, the others dropped to the floor, convulsing, their eyes rolling back into their heads as if something unseen was tearing at their very souls. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, as the walls of the cabin began to bleed, the same thick, dark blood we had seen in the chamber. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The lights flickered back on, and I was alone. The cabin was silent, the bodies of my crew lying motionless on the blood-soaked floor. I could feel the curse tightening its grip on me, the cold breath of death on my neck. But I couldn't leave, not yet. There was something I needed to do. Something the curse demanded of me. The stillness in the cabin was suffocating, an oppressive silence that bore down on me as I stood among the bodies of my fallen crew. The relic, now resting in the center of the room, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Its eyes, glowing that sickly green, bored into me, as if daring me to make a move. I was alone, truly alone on this cursed island. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of my perception, was stronger than ever. I should have left. I knew that. But something held me in place, a force, unseen and malevolent, that wrapped its icy fingers around my heart and refused to let go. The relic called to me, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. It promised riches, power, everything I had come to the island to find. But at what cost? The smell of decay was overwhelming, the stench of death seeping into my very soul. I stumbled to the door, desperate for fresh air, for some semblance of reality outside this nightmare. But as I stepped out into the cold night, the island itself seemed to shift and warp around me. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if I were walking on the edge of a vast, unseen chasm. I knew what I had to do. The relic had to be destroyed. It was the only way to break the curse, to put an end to the horrors that had befallen us. But how do you destroy something so ancient, so powerful, that it seems to be woven into the very fabric of the island? As I made my way back to the chamber, the path seemed longer, more treacherous. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant whispers, the faint echo of footsteps that weren't my own. I could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent trailing me, its gaze heavy on the back of my neck. Every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking horror. Every breath was a struggle against the fear that gnawed at my mind. When I finally reached the entrance to the tunnels, I hesitated. The darkness within was absolute, an inky void that seemed to devour the light from my flashlight. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped inside. The tunnels were narrower now, the walls closing in on me as I descended deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, my breath fogging in front of me. The sound of dripping water echoed through the passages, but there was something else too. A faint rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of some great unseen beast. The chamber was just as I remembered, but the relic, it had changed. The stone idol, once twisted and grotesque, was now pulsating with that sickly green light. The walls of the chamber were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly, as if charged with some dark energy, and the air was thick with the scent of blood. I approached the relic cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, filling my mind with thoughts that weren't my own. It was as if the relic was alive, a sentient thing that fed on fear, on the very essence of those who dared to disturb it. I raised the pickaxe, my hands trembling, but before I could strike, the ground beneath me shook violently, throwing me off balance. The walls of the chamber began to close in, the ceiling descending, as if the island itself were trying to swallow me whole. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, but the exit was gone, sealed off by the very earth. And then I heard it, the voice. It wasn't a whisper now, but a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the island. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. You cannot escape. The room grew colder, the light from my flashlight flickering and then going out completely. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the relic, which now glowed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could feel it, the presence of something ancient and evil, watching me, waiting. Suddenly the walls of the chamber began to bleed. Thick, dark blood oozed from the stone, filling the room with the foul stench of death. It rose quickly, pooling around my feet, then my ankles until I was wading through it. My heart raced as I realized the blood wasn't stopping. It was rising, faster and faster, threatening to drown me. I thrashed through the blood, trying to find a way out, but the room was a maze of darkness and terror. The relic's glow was blinding now, its power overwhelming, and I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me down into the blood. My lungs burned as I struggled to keep my head above the surface, the taste of iron filling my mouth. And then I saw them, the faces. Twisted, contorted in agony, they emerged from the blood, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They were the crew, my companions, their bodies bloated and decayed, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for me, their hands cold and clammy, dragging me down into the depths. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was no use. The blood was everywhere, filling my mouth, my nose, my lungs. I was drowning, suffocating in the curse that I had brought upon us. Just as my vision began to fade, I felt something hard and sharp beneath my hand. The relic. It was there, just within reach. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I grabbed it, my fingers closing around the cold stone. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, wet ground, my clothes soaked through with blood. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. I coughed, gasping for air, the metallic taste of blood still fresh in my mouth. The chamber was gone, replaced by a dense fog that clung to the trees like a shroud. The relic, once glowing with an eerie green light, was now cold and lifeless in my hand. For a moment, I thought I was dead, that the curse had claimed me just like it had the others. But the dull ache in my bones told me otherwise. I was alive, barely, but something had changed. The island was different, more sinister, as if it had absorbed the horrors of the night before and become something darker. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The fog was thick, almost impenetrable, but I could make out the faint outline of the cabin through the haze. My heart sank as I realized I would have to go back to the place where everything had started, to the relic that had brought nothing but death and misery. With each step I took, the fog seemed to close in around me, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Faces appeared in the mist, twisted, tormented faces of the crew who had died because of my greed, my arrogance. They reached out to me, their hollow eyes filled with blame and accusation, their mouths forming words that sent chills down my spine. You did this. You brought this upon us. I stumbled through the fog, trying to block out their voices, but the guilt weighed heavily on my soul. They were right. I had come to this cursed island in search of treasure, of fortune, and now everyone was dead because of it. But there was still one thing left to do, one final act that might set things right. As I neared the cabin, the fog began to thin, revealing the grotesque scene inside. The bodies of my crew lay where they had fallen, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The walls were splattered with blood, the stench of decay overwhelming. And there, in the center of the room, was the relic. Cold, dark, and silent, but something was different. The air around the relic crackled with energy, the very atmosphere charged with a malevolent force. The island was alive with it, pulsating with the power of the curse. I knew what I had to do, but fear gnawed at me, threatening to paralyze me. Destroying the relic was the only way to end this nightmare. But I also knew that whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. With trembling hands, I reached for the relic. The moment my fingers touched the cold stone, a shock of pain shot through me, searing every nerve in my body. I screamed, dropping the relic to the floor, but the pain didn't stop. It intensified, spreading like wildfire, as if the curse was trying to consume me from the inside out. I fell to my knees, writhing in agony, the world around me spinning out of control. The fog swirled around me, closing in, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. The faces of the crew were everywhere, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths stretched into silent screams. And then in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. A voice, cold and cruel, cutting through the noise like a knife. Asterisk. You cannot destroy what is eternal. Asterisk. The voice came from the relic itself, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the cabin, shaking the very foundation of the island. The ground beneath me cracked and splintered, the walls of the cabin creaking and groaning as if they were being torn apart by some unseen force. The air was thick with the stench of death, the blood of the island rising up to consume everything in its path. I clutched my head, trying to block out the voice, but it was inside me now, echoing in my mind, twisting my thoughts, driving me to the brink of madness. The relic's power was overwhelming, a dark, malevolent force that fed on fear, on pain, on the very essence of life itself. Asterisk, you will join them, the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. Asterisk. You will become one with the island, bound to the curse for all eternity. Asterisk. No! I screamed, fighting against the force that threatened to pull me under. I won't let you take me! But the voice only laughed, a deep, echoing sound that sent shivers down my spine. The ground beneath me buckled, the floorboards splintering as the blood rose higher, swallowing everything in its path. The walls of the cabin began to close in, the ceiling descending as if the island itself were trying to crush me, to bury me alive. Desperation took hold as I realized there was no escape. The curse was too powerful, too ancient, and it had already claimed me. But there was one last thing I could do, one final act of defiance. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached out and grabbed the relic. The pain was unbearable, but I held on, refusing to let go. The island roared in anger, the walls of the cabin shaking violently as the relic's power surged through me, threatening to tear me apart. But I didn't care. I knew what I had to do. With a primal scream, I hurled the relic into the fire that was still smoldering in the corner of the cabin. The moment the stone hit the flames, the room exploded with light, a blinding flash that consumed everything. The air crackled with energy, the walls of the cabin splintering and collapsing as the curse was finally unleashed in full force. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the cabin was gone, replaced by a charred, barren landscape. The trees were twisted and blackened, the ground scorched and cracked. The fog had lifted, revealing the true horror of what had been unleashed. The island was a wasteland, a place of death and despair, cursed for all eternity. I was the only one left, the sole survivor of the curse that had claimed so many lives. But I was not the same. The island had marked me, its darkness seeping into my soul, binding me to its fate. I could feel it, the curse, alive and pulsing within me, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as I stood there staring out at the desolation, I realized the truth. The curse could never be destroyed. It would live on, through me, through anyone who dared to seek the treasure of Oak Island. Because the island doesn't just take lives, it takes souls. And now, it had mine.